when Steve said that he was surprised to see my name on something on Central Asia, if you had asked me about this 5 years ago, I would have been surprised as well. I certainly don't want to present myself as a Central Asia specialist. I'm not. I'm more of an Asia hand with a political economy focus. But the reason we at our center have done this book, and we're doing 2 others, is that we thought it was important to try to look at U.S. China relations in a broader context, not just to focus on Washington and Beijing, but to look at how the U.S. and China interact with each other in different regions of the world. So we're doing 3 books. This one that you have now, which we've completed on Central Asia, one on Southeast Asia, which is about to come out in about maybe 8 or 9 months, and then one on Latin America, which will probably come out in about 12 or 14 months. What we have tried to do in this series is get a sense for how the U.S. and China interact when their interests are different and where the concerns that they have to deal with are different. The reason that I think this is important is that there has been such a tendency to focus on just the strategic interaction in the 1970s and early 80s, and then from the 80s until a few years ago, primarily the economic interaction. We have missed what China and the U.S. are doing in what I call third regions. You'll notice that we didn't do a book on Africa. There are a fair number of books on China's role in Africa, so I don't think that's necessary. And of course, with all the excitement about the Nansha Islands and the questions of sovereignty in the South China Sea, there's been much written on Southeast Asia, but in the Southeast Asia book, we're looking more broadly at the questions of how Southeast Asia is developing and what the U.S. and Chinese role will be. But let me just do a quick overview. As Steve said, I'm just going to speak for 20 to 25 minutes, give you a sense for what the basic issues in the book are, and then I'll try to respond to your questions. If you look at the handout that we've given you, it covers the basic statistical information about the countries. When we define Central Asia, we focused on the 5 former stands: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And I have the basic information about their incomes, their populations, and so on. I think the thing to notice, first of all, you'll also notice in the handout a map, which I think is important because it gives you a sense for some of the closeness and proximity to other key powers. Also, for those of you who have an interest in history, you can see Mongolia in the upper right. You can see how the Mongols got into Russia by going across the top part of what's now Kazakhstan and in towards Moscow. And if you have ever talked to a Russian about their views about the Mongols or the Chinese, a lot of it was affected by that. And certainly Central Asia was very strongly affected by that Mongol period. Just to say a few general things that are worth noting, the GDP of the entire 5 countries is slightly larger than Pakistan, but it's only about 40% the size of Turkey. So it's a small GDP combined, so it's a relatively small market, but an increasingly critical one because of the oil and natural gas there. In terms of regime types, we're talking about 1 democracy, Kyrgyzstan, and 4 authoritarian regimes. And again, during questions, we can go into that in more detail. In terms of the basic period since independence in 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, I think it's fair to divide that into 3 broad periods. The 90s, where the countries were essentially establishing their autonomy, and their central focus was to establish their autonomy not only vis-a-vis the outside world, but vis-a-vis their neighbors within Central Asia. In early 2000, things turned up. In the 90s, the economic turmoil was severe because they had all been part of the ruble zone. As they left that, they didn't have the subsidies coming from Russia. They had very severe inflation, a lot of economic distortion and uncertainty. In the 2000s, 2 things happened. 9/11 happened, and it enabled the authoritarian regimes to begin cracking down on Islamic insurgency. They also got cooperation from the U.S. on that, and they got cooperation in certain ways from the Russians. A modest amount from the Chinese, but very, very modest. However, after about 2008, with the economic crisis here, you have a much more mixed record. We can get into that during questions if you'd like. But you have very poor countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan in the southern tier. Now newly wealthy countries like Turkmenistan, which has the fourth largest oil and gas reserves in the world, and then Kazakhstan, which also has oil and gas, but also has industry and a higher level of development. So that's a very quick overview. Let me just say a couple of the current trends that are important, and again, during questions I'll be glad to respond to any of this. But I would say the principal goal of the Central Asian countries is still autonomy. They got a great deal of early pressure and encouragement to integrate, to form common market, to have political cooperation. None of that, I would say, has been particularly successful. A second general tendency, which I think is important, and is my basic theme tonight, and that is that the U.S. and China are really operating on separate orthogonals. So if you remember any of your high school algebra, they're basically sort of passing in the night. China is essentially interested in natural resources, particularly oil and gas, but also some of the cotton and some of the agricultural products. But it has tried to stay away from security issues. And the U.S., certainly since 9/11, in the last 14 years, has been overwhelmingly concentrated on security questions. Now, when we start to talk about the future, we're going to see a different pattern, because the U.S. is clearly leaving from the region, and China is going to have to decide what role it's going to play in security matters. And China has made a big investment. If you consider Afghanistan to be part of Central Asia, obviously we've made a very big investment. But most of the U.S. involvement in Central Asia in the last 15 years has been a modest amount of aid and focused on transit to Afghanistan. The Chinese are focused on the resource extraction and infrastructure development. And when we talk about the future, I'll mention a little bit about Idai-Lu, the Silk Road, and the Belt. The question is, how far is that going? But so far, if you actually look at the numbers, China has put much more attention into two countries, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. It's put a relatively modest amount in the other three. Now, in terms of objectives, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. objectives in Central Asia are to limit Islamic extremism. We favor political stability, and many Americans in this administration and the prior administration would like to limit the decline of U.S. influence. But I think there's absolutely no question that U.S. influence is declining. The two countries that have the ability to have any long-term influence in Central Asia who are outside the region are Russia and China. So I'm going to concentrate mostly on them. When you start asking what can they possibly do, the first is, from the Chinese perspective, is the Silk Road and the links between the center part of China and Europe and the Middle East. So Central Asia is interesting from a strategist standpoint because it's at the intersection of South Asia. If you look on the map, you'll see the northern part of Pakistan there, India, of course, just below that. The whole issue of Arunachal Pradesh, for those of you who are India specialists, know that the Chinese and Indians are contesting that territory. That's just to the east. But China clearly is concerned about having links to the Middle East go through this region, either rail or road links. And obviously, their first priority is economics. But the Chinese, in my opinion, will be facing, over the next 3 to 5 years, the question of are they going to get involved in the security issues that are going to arise. The reason I think they're going to arise is because we can see from the news yesterday that Kunduz has already fallen to the Taliban. ISIS is already operating in Afghanistan, and I think any reasonable prognostication on Afghanistan is that it's going to descend into the same kind of disorder that Iraq has. And so China not only has major investments there in Afghanistan, a big copper mine and some other resource extraction efforts, but they're going to have to deal with the question of the political instability. One little thing to note, which I didn't know until I started this project, is if you look at this map and then you follow the Afghan line, there's a little finger that reaches up and actually touches China. So the Chinese can actually get into Afghanistan by walking or driving or riding tanks. They don't have to fly to get there. And they obviously have to be worried about Islamic extremism. Now,
it's pretty mountainous.
Yes. Now the question is, why is China beginning to look west rather than east? And this is a matter of speculation. If you look in the concluding chapter of the book, you'll see I clearly label this as speculation. But I would argue that China has not been particularly successful in its efforts to expand its influence in Northeast Asia. Certainly, there's a great deal of turmoil that surrounded the Diaoyu Islands question, and the Chinese didn't get very far in their strategy there. And they're also incurring a great deal of pushback and resistance in Southeast Asia. Not as much as some of the Southeast Asians would like, but clearly, if you look at both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, the Chinese have to say to themselves, these have limited promise for the future, and the Chinese have been successful in the northern part of Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, in Cambodia, and Laos, but they have not been successful in getting close and warm relations with most of the rest of the ASEAN countries. So I would argue that they see looking west as having both a defensive and an offensive capability. An offensive capability in the sense that they want to be able to be active in markets, they want to be able to play a role in the foreign policy decision making that comes out of the region, and they also see it as one where things are more congenial to them than they are if they try to go east. And I think that's what's behind the Silk Road and Silk Belt. And obviously the concern with India is important. So that's a quick summary of the concerns that the Chinese face. The Russians obviously are in a resurgent position. I think all of us were probably surprised when we woke up Monday morning and read that Russia had arranged essentially an informal alliance between Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Certainly the U.S. intelligence community didn't warn the president about this, and so most of us probably didn't know about it either. But what this means clearly is a Shia alliance in the northern part of that area of the Middle East. It's going to complicate our relations in many ways, and it also is going to complicate China's decision making, because the Chinese want to get along with both the Shia and the Sunni parts of the Middle East. China is the largest importer of Iranian oil, and it also is a very large importer of Saudi oil and Kuwaiti oil. So the Chinese need to get along with both sides of that conflict. So part of the Silk Road and the Silk Belt and the Belt are designed to give them a set of links and a set of options in the future. With the Russians, we have a tendency in this country to still see them as part of the Cold War mentality that many of us grew up with. And it looks certainly as if President Putin has outmaneuvered the U.S. in terms of this new alliance that he's created. It's certainly created new problems. And the Russians are clearly resurgent in what I would call the northern part of the Middle East. The other thing to note, for those of you who are not following Central Asia closely, is that the Russians still have a very strong cultural influence in Central Asia. There's a great deal of intermarriage between Central Asians and Russians. The Central Asian elite still goes to Moscow for training, and the Russians draw on that. And for those of you who like to do speculation, much of the talk about political influence and behind-the-scenes activity relates to Russian intelligence operations in Central Asia. So there's no question that the Russians intend to play a key role there. The question is where we come in, we, the U.S., and I would say that we know where President Obama stands. He wants to reduce our involvement in these kind of conflict areas. And I would say if he proceeds with extracting U.S. troops from Afghanistan by the end of next year, it would be very hard for any future president of either party to go back to Afghanistan, and certainly very hard to play any major role in this region. So I'm basically predicting a decline of U.S. involvement in Central Asia, and if there are major powers on the outside who are going to play a role, it's going to be China and Russia. Now, I think during questions, and I want to leave plenty of time for those, we can go into the details. If you look at on this handout, I've listed all the different organizations that the Central Asian countries join. They are sort of compulsive joiners, joining all kinds of regional and cooperative organizations. We can talk about some of them. What's interesting is the level of commitment that China has made for new multilateral organizations. Let me just go over some of the numbers. It's stunning. For the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Chinese have committed $50 billion. For the new development bank, which is part of the BRICS, they are committed $100 billion. They've committed $40 billion to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Development Fund, and they're committed $46 billion to Pakistan's Economic Corridor. So you add all that up, it comes to over $230 billion. Obviously, it hasn't been spent, but these are pledges. These countries and regions are going to try to extract that. So there's no question that China is on the hook for a major commitment, certainly on a scale vastly larger than the U.S. has committed over the last 15 years. So I think I'll end there. If you look on the back of the handout, I have a little table which talks about future political influence, and during questions we can talk about those if you'd like.
David. Hello.
You have to push it up. Here we go.
It's a great summary of what's in the book. I guess my first, the book kind of lays out that, in an area in Central Asia, really the U.S. and China are not adverse. That the idea that we have conflicting interests it's just not not right. Are there areas where in Central Asia where the U.S. and China should increase cooperation and become a model for cooperation elsewhere in the world?
Well, what I'd say is that there's certainly no reason at all why we can't cooperate economically. When Secretary Clinton was Secretary of State, she made a number of commitments about American economic resources to be involved in some of the early Silk Road project ideas that the Chinese were raising. So I don't think there's anything either diplomatically or in terms of economic conflict that would keep us from cooperating. I think the real issue is that in the last 5 years, as shale gas extraction has developed in this country, we have enough natural gas here, and there's a lot of associated oil with that natural gas. And so we don't need either the oil or the gas from Central Asia. Some of you may know that some prominent Americans have been involved in trying to promote pipelines out of Central Asia. Some going south. There's one called the TAPI, which is Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. One of our former ambassadors to the UN of Afghan origin, who you may know, was promoting this particular pipeline. I don't think any of these things will be built as long as Pakistan is as unstable as it is. India would like it. India would like to have greater influence there. And I think at the margins, there are areas where the U.S. can be useful. I don't, however, see the U.S. making a major commitment because our economic interests are no longer tied to the region. So I think it's going to be at the margin. It's not going to be a central part of American aid strategy.
Any risk of, I mean, Kazakhstan obviously shares a large border with Russia. Any risk that if the government changed in such a way that we would see a repeat of Ukraine in Kazakhstan?
Well, obviously there's some risk. Again, very few people anticipated the Russian role in Crimea, and there was talk about what they might do in eastern Ukraine, but I don't think, certainly most analysts that I'm aware of would not have anticipated that Russia would take the risk that it's taken. I think with Central Asia, the question for the Russians is, can they get what they want without being blatant? And at the moment, they can. And this is because of the cultural ties that I mentioned. The intermarriage, the language ties, the educational training, it gives them a lot of access to the elites in Central Asia that they wouldn't have otherwise. Now, let me mention there are a couple of caveats. Turkmenistan is a very unusual place. You would think, because of its name, that the Turkmens would be close to Turkey. In fact, they don't want to have anything to do with Turkey. Turkmenistan is a very isolationist country, wants to stay away from all the major powers. They're willing to cooperate with China, but because they see themselves as a long way away from China. I think if they bordered on China, they might be more skeptical. But they've just made a very big deal, over a $5 billion deal for development of oil and gas. The Russians, because they are short on resources, and because they also have their own oil and gas, don't have any desire to see Central Asian gas compete with theirs. So the Russians frequently say that they're interested in pipelines or say that they're interested in things, and then it turns out that nothing ever happens. So I would say the longer pipelines that have been discussed, like Nabucco and so on, going west and south towards Turkey, are not likely to proceed. And as I mentioned, the TAPI pipeline going down towards India isn't likely to function or have people invest in it until Pakistan gets more stable. And when Pakistan will get more stable is beyond my analytical ability.
Yeah.
What's percentage of Central Asian population is Uyghur? And what is the base of terrorism risk that exists in that area, that as China's problems with the Uyghurs heighten, is it possible that this area would be a base for terrorist attacks within China? We've seen an enormous spike in terrorist attacks in China. Whether the U.S. government calls them terrorist attacks or not, I think that's a different issue, but certainly we've seen this spike since 2013.
Yeah.
And some are directed from abroad and some are homegrown.
I can't give you the exact percentage that are Uyghur, but all 5 countries are Muslim. All 5 countries are run by people who I would call secular Muslims. They do not want to have a religious state. In Uzbekistan, you have a very strong Islamist movement, which has directly challenged the government. There's the big debate about exactly what happened in Andijan in 2005, but there's no question that there was a revolt, and there's no question that it was related to Muslims. So the Chinese are worried about this, but they have been very happy to see Uncle Sam standing out front and doing the heavy lifting. But for the reasons that I mentioned, I anticipate that China will be having to make some big decisions in the next 3 to 5 years of how to deal with this. So whether we see Chinese advisors in Central Asia, whether we see Chinese intelligence play a larger role there, I'm not sure. The Russians are already there, and as we all know, the Russians were very definitive and brutal in putting the Chechens down in the Caucasus. and they are willing to cooperate with the Central Asian. So this might be something where the Russians and the Chinese actually cooperate. I would say on
Unless
organizations.
if you had a change from the secular to
Yeah.
the religious within the
Well,
the government.
there are two presidents, Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan and Karimov in Uzbekistan, who are in their 80s. And so both of them presumably will have successors at some reasonable point in the future. So we can't predict it. But what we can say is that China is going to be seized with this problem, and they have been able to avoid getting directly involved in the last 15 years.
What's the level of corruption in those states?
Massive.
Relative to China? Worse?
The difference is that they are much less developed. And so the economic levers are entirely controlled by government and the top figures in government. And most of the leadership are related to the families of the survivors of the transition from the Soviet era to the independence era. So I would say it's family-related corruption and a lot of turmoil as a result of that. If you think of some of our soap operas, there are elements that are comparable in Central Asia.
Any cleanup campaign? Any Xi Jinping anti-corruption effort? Is there a Wang Qishan in Central Asia?
There's no central figure, and what's interesting is that Kyrgyzstan is a democracy, and there is open debate and contestation and many claims. Also, there are numerous rumors that the reason that Kyrgyzstan has changed the terms of the base agreement for the U.S. is because different people had to be compensated. That is entirely speculation, and I don't have any details on that, but it wouldn't surprise me. In the other cases, with Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, you've got extensive family obligations, people that need to be maintained in their current living style. And so if they were to change, then yes, there could be a change of not only who receives compensation, but who has power.
Did you hear from any of the governments after the book came out?
We invited several of the governments to come to our original conference where we presented the papers. And it was interesting to see, I won't comment on individual countries because I don't want to embarrass them, but Turkmenistan didn't want to send anybody. And what was interesting was that some of the participants from the authoritarian countries were a little bit like China in the sense that they were proud to be authoritarian and were proud to handle their political affairs the way they did, and didn't seem to have any embarrassment about the way they were run. So I think there are some minor similarities in that regard. But what we're talking about are countries with small populations, small GDPs, but vast land area. So they are vulnerable to pressure from outside.
Last question, then I'll open it to the floor. What are the lessons in this for the U.S. China relationship generally? In other words, what can we take from the Central Asia, Russia, China, U.S. relationship and apply to kind of our bilateral relationship with China?
Well, that, of course, gets at the purpose of this whole project. And as I mentioned at the beginning, our purpose is to try to show that, as many China specialists have pointed out for decades, that this is a very complicated set of choices. And to allow whatever's happening directly between Washington and Beijing to necessarily affect what Washington and Beijing do in other parts of the world is unnecessary. So, for example, There are areas where China and the U.S. are cooperating now in Africa, and as Steve's question hinted at, and as I've said, there's certainly no reason why, on economic grounds, we can't cooperate in Central Asia. What will be interesting, however, is to see whether the Idai-Lu strategy is part of a broader strategic venture, or whether it is primarily economic, and I don't think we know that yet. So, but in Southeast Asia, for example, I would say that the conflict is pretty clear. The Obama administration has chosen to avoid directly challenging China over the possession of the islands, but the next administration may be different. And in Latin America, again, for those of you who don't follow this, most Americans are not aware about the extent of China's economic involvement, which is massive. It's massive in places like Panama, Venezuela, Cuba, but it's also in some large economies like Argentina and Brazil. So over time, the question is, are these strategic investments designed to exert political power, or are these primarily economic? So I would say the basic theme of this series of books is that one needs to look region by region to see what that interaction is going to be.
The question, are they strategic or economic?
Exactly. And,
Right.
And I don't think we have the answer. I think in some cases,
I think we do.
it may be a mixture. Well, no, but the point is, in Central Asia...
If you talk to the companies that make, well, that's for the next
Yeah.
your next book, but you
Yeah.
talk to the companies that are making those investment decisions, and they're making them on an economic basis. A lot of them are publicly listed, and these are attempts to grow their business and increase their market value. I mean,
Okay,
it's-
but to be very blunt, China, as I said, has made commitments of over 200 billion to Central Asia and points west.
You mean the aid?
Well, no, it's
No,
not.
AIB,
It's
in
not
other
all.
words,
It's
the
not all
aid is different from.
It's not all aid.
Mhm.
I had this summer at our center a visitor from Peking University whose entire focus was to try to pin down what were the details of the Silk Road agreements, and he was not able to do it because it's all still
No one can.
confidential.
Right.
So I'm not sure that we can answer the question the way you posed it. We know that it's a mixture.
Well, we know there's no Silk Road agreement, it's a policy.
Yeah, it's
So
a direction to go.
Yeah.
But
It's a policy. It's like the Zhou the going out policy of China. How it's implemented predominantly by the private sector.
Yes, but the point is, it's public resources which are facilitating. It's going to be the equivalent of OPIC in this country, AID, and Exim Bank, which sadly is gone in this country, but it's not gone in China. So it's a mixture of public and private resources.
This has been a terrific discussion, but let me open the floor. I know we have Ambassador Cunningham here, who has spent a not insignificant part of his career in this neighborhood, at least. Do we have a microphone? Do we have a mic at all? Is there any, you want to make any comments on that? That would be terrific.
I want to ask a question. Do we need a mic or?
I think partly because we tape these and then we put them up on the web, and they're viewed, a few thousand times. So it's good that folks who look at it later can hear us.
Yeah, so thanks. So my name is Jim Cunningham. I was the U.S. ambassador in Afghanistan until December. Now retired, and I'm with the Atlantic Council, which has just done a report on China and Latin America, by the way, if you haven't seen it. So you mentioned several times what I think is one of the crucial issues for our relationship with China in that part of the world, and for that part of the world, which is, will China become a contributor or a producer of security? The American government, during the time that I was involved in this, made a substantial effort to convince Beijing that they had a security responsibility in their interest as well as in ours, and that we had shared interests and objectives, and they should be doing more on the ground to contribute to stability in the region as a whole. And they've recently taken some steps in that regard, as they've become more concerned about the terrorist influence coming from Pakistan through Afghanistan to China, the realization that instability in Afghanistan and Pakistan is a threat eventually to their economic interests as well as their physical security. My question is, since you've been looking at this now rather intensively, what do you think the prospects are for them doing something that, as far as I know, is really pretty unique, which is exerting themselves outside their immediate area on behalf of an approach to regional security from their point of view that doesn't exist right now?
Well, Steve is the one who's been traveling with Xi Jinping. I haven't. So I have no idea what his personal perspective is on this. The people that I talk to are essentially technocrats, and they are very cautious. They don't want to be involved. They see it as dangerous. They were very happy, as I mentioned, for the U.S. to be shouldering the burden, and for not only for the U.S. to take the casualties, but for the U.S. to take the blame from Muslim countries who felt that we shouldn't be there. So they are very torn about what to do. And I think the fact that they made the commitment of the $46 billion to Pakistan is an indication that they would like to see Pakistan do the heavy lifting. Since we, and you're well aware of this, we know how extensively involved Pakistan is in Afghan affairs. My guess is that they will try to use Pakistan as a proxy rather than trying to get directly involved. If Pakistan proves as difficult to deal with for the Chinese as they have for the U.S., which may well be the case, then they're going to have to make some difficult choices. But I think coming back to Steve's point, China is going to concentrate first on Xinjiang and the Uyghur issue. What's interesting is so far they do not seem to have made any big investment in Uzbekistan, where the biggest Islamic insurgency is. I think they're happy and comfortable with their relationship with Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. For Kyrgyzstan, they see it basically as a transit point. There's a lot of trade that goes through Kyrgyzstan. And the Tajiks have almost no links with them. I will note, of course, you know this because of your Afghan experience, but for those who don't follow this region closely, there is a very sizable number of Tajiks in the northern part of Afghanistan. They're all militarized. They all had lots of military experience. And if at some point in the future there were to be conflict, there might be cross-border conflict. Right now, there's not cross-border conflict. But I guess if I was forced to answer your question of will the Chinese intervene, I would say only under duress and under circumstances where they see no alternative. And they certainly are likely to try to use Pakistan as their proxy, as their first alternative.
I think that's right. I also think, President Xi made a big commitment to 8,000 permanent peacekeepers under UN auspices, which was interesting. When we saw this grisly murder from Thailand, committed in Thailand, this grisly murder committed in Thailand, which was, of a bunch of Chinese, one would say that might be serious duress, but the Chinese did not go in. They worked with intelligence and with police forces, and ultimately the Thai police delivered the murderers to China. There is the territorial integrity portion of Chinese foreign policy is quite real. It's quite real. Bill? Yeah. And then I'm going to have to excuse myself, unfortunately, for another ambassador. But Margot, you want to take my chair?
Sure. Steve, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your presentation, Dave. Roughly what percentage of the population in Central Asia is Muslim? I assume it's over 90%.
Yes. Yeah.
And is it primarily Shiite or Sunni? Or?
It's primarily Sunni. The Tajiks in the south, again, for those of you who don't follow the region, Tajik is essentially Persian, and there are some Tajiks who are Shia and some who are Sunni. But Central Asia is overwhelmingly Sunni.
And if I may just, you mentioned just a minute ago about there are areas in Africa where the U.S. and China are cooperating. I'm wondering if you could just...
I think the Sudan is the principal example.
And that's on security issues?
Well, basically, the Chinese have invested in Sudan to extract oil, and we, the U.S., have put pressure on the Chinese to try to reach a political solution in South Sudan. And the Chinese didn't want to get involved, so my answer would be similar to my answer to Ambassador Cunningham. The Chinese didn't want to be involved, but they realized ultimately that it was to their advantage to try to play a role in brokering the peace, and I think they did. Now, will they enforce it? I don't know. And as Steve mentioned, they have made a commitment for peacekeepers. The question is, where will they be deployed? What will be the terms of engagement? Those things matter a great deal.
Please identify yourself.
Herbert Levin. Could you referred to U.S. attitudes toward the region, Chinese attitudes toward the region. Could you spend a little more time differentiating between the attitudes of the 5 countries you deal with to the outside world? I know very little about them, but in Kyrgyzstan they had a very different attitude to who outside the region they wanted to associate with, as, for example, they did in Almaty, the Kazakhs. So I have the feeling that a lot of these questions which you have illuminated for us will probably be decided more by the local attitudes than they will by the outside actors. I wonder if you could discuss those different attitudes a little bit. I mean, the Tajiks are not the Kyrgyz in the way they look at the world.
Exactly, I agree. Let me back up and say a little bit about U.S. policy in the 90s. In the 90s, I think many Americans looking at Central Asia were optimistic that it would become a democracy or a democratic region. The different party institutes were very active there. A great deal of aid was focused on political development. Obviously, only one of the 5 became democratic. And it's a pretty unstable democracy. That's Kyrgyzstan. The Kyrgyz are a relatively small group. If you ask Kyrgyz, they will even describe themselves as tribal, which means that they focus on marriage within the group and see that as very important. The Kyrgyz are the most sympathetic to the Russians because the Russians are far away and the Russians occasionally help them. They're most worried about the Chinese because they border directly on China. The Tajiks look south. The Tajiks are worried about the Tajiks in Afghanistan, but Tajikistan is extremely poor. It's basically agricultural. Human capital is very limited, and the regime is, I would say, fragile. Their hope is that nobody will notice them. And Turkmenistan is different because in Turkmenistan, there is an active policy of neutrality. So for those of you who like analogies to different parts of the world, they're more like the Swiss. Their view is that they want to declare their neutrality at every turn. Now, if you look on this handout that I've given out, you'll see that the Turkmen strategy has been to join some of the groups. They've joined the Organization of Islamic Community, things like that, but they do not want to be part of regional economic integration. They don't want to be part of a Russian sphere of influence, and they definitely do not want India, Iran, or Turkey messing around in their territory. So it's very hard to get visas to go there. You can't do research there. It's an extremely isolated place. Uzbekistan has the largest population of the Central Asian countries, even though it's relatively small. It has this wonderfully fertile valley, the Fergana Valley, which most of us know about, and that has led to a high level of agricultural development, but it also is the place where, as I mentioned, there's the strongest Islamic insurgency. The most confident and sort of middle income state, obviously, is Kazakhstan. Not only does it have a middle income GDP, but it has universities, it has modern cities, and because of its size, it stretches all the way from China on the east to Russia on the west, down towards the Caspian and so on. And so the Kazakhs see themselves as natural leaders of the region. The Uzbeks see themselves as natural leaders of the region because they're the largest in population. The Tajiks, as I said, try to avoid being noticed, and the Turkmens don't want to have anything to do with the region. So, does that answer your question?
Can I have a follow-up?
Yeah.
Some time ago, I saw a thing on airline travel. Where did the routes go? Directly, so you didn't have to go to Moscow and then down.
Yes.
And it was very interesting. A lot of them went to Turkey. And then I saw ticket sales. Where do they go? And then very imperfectly, if they get scholarships or something, where do they go abroad? They don't seem to want to go to Moscow anymore, even though their fathers speak Russian. Do you have any of these soft indicators of where their ties might be going?
Well, I'm glad to see Herb is a follower of the Karl Deutsch tradition of analyzing interactions. We, in the Russian chapter of the book, there is a very detailed discussion about the Russian influence and its decline in certain areas and it's continuing in others. The Russians are still very strong in Kazakhstan, and as I mentioned, they're strong in Kyrgyzstan because the Kyrgyz see them as non-threatening. The Russians intervened in Tajikistan and produced a lot of resentment over that. So my feeling is that the outside world has assumed that these countries will integrate, cooperate, and act as a group. And all those assumptions are false. So that's a direct answer to your question.
Yeah, Martin Ripplin, can I expand slightly on something you said?
Of course.
A so-called or some kind of treaty between Russia and Syria, Iraq, and Iran. I'm wondering if this will in any way influence the Iranian-American nuclear agreement, if that would have effect in Central Asia, if it does, if it could. Hopefully not.
Well, again, I wasn't privy to the discussions between the president and President Putin, so I don't know what took place there. Since this was reported as coming as a surprise to the American intelligence community and to the president, I assume that there's no clear formulated policy on the part of the U.S. yet on what to do. And even if there was a formulated policy, the question is whether they would implement it. Do you want to rephrase your question? Are you saying how will it influence Central Asia, or how will it influence U.S. policy?
U.S. policy, and would it influence the nuclear agreement?
Oh, well, obviously, if this new arrangement, and I don't know exactly how to define it, if the new arrangement meant that Iran, Iraq, and Syria were all going to cooperate closely and directly undercut what the U.S. wanted, I think that would make it harder for the U.S. to have confidence in the Iranian nuclear agreement. But I think we all know that President Obama has made a major personal and political commitment to seeing the agreement implemented. So I think he had to have been shocked by what took place. If you see any of the pictures of him meeting Putin, or the picture in today's New York Times on the front page, where he's putting out his hand to shake his hand, and Putin's trying to decide, does he want to shake his hand or not? Those kind of things are just, to come back to Herb Levin's point, sort of soft indicators of how the interaction might be. My guess is that Obama is so committed to the Iranian nuclear agreement, he will try to press it throughout the rest of his term. Also, there's no question that it was a surprise that the Iraqis went along with this, but we don't know what the Iraqis can produce. They can't defend their own country, so I don't know whether they're going to be able to do much relating to Syria.
Jan and then Yo-Yo.
Jan Barris with the National Committee. I'm not a follower of Carl Deutsch, but I do want to follow up on Herb's question and
Yes.
ask the same question vis-a-vis China. So how much Chinese resources, either government resources or support from the private sector, is going toward language training for Chinese in the various languages represented? How much air travel is there among them? And what's just the same set of questions that Herb asked about Russia?
Well, I can't give you a precise answer to that, but the Chinese are very mindful of this. Let me mention the three Chinese authors in the book and tell you something about their different orientations. The specialist on the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was Pan Guang from the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. The specialist on Russia and Russian relations was Xinguang Sheng from the China Academy of Social Sciences. And the economist was Li Xin from the Shanghai Institute of International Studies. Each of them had a slightly different perspective. What was interesting to me was that Li Xin and Xinguang Sheng were sort of old Russia hands. They were trained in sort of the China-Russia tradition. They were very much what I would call language intensive, traditional, what we would call area studies people. And there is a sizable group around them in the academies and in the universities, and China is pressing for that. I would say Pan Guang was much more like what we would call an IR person, international relations person, interested in a broad range of indicators, and he has some other Middle East experience, works on different countries in the Middle East. So I would say the older they are in China, the more likely it is that they focus just on one country. The younger they are, the more likely it is that they focus on a region or several regions, did comparative work, the kind of thing that's in this series that we're talking about. But there's absolutely no question that the Confucius Institutes are functioning in Central Asia. The Chinese are trying to draw as many recruits as they can. Also, the Chinese are offering jobs, and plenty of people are quite happy to get a job. And so one of the big exports from Central Asia is labor. So a lot of the Kyrgyz, a lot of the Kazakhs, and many of the Uzbeks migrate to different parts of Russia and some other parts of Europe on a seasonal basis. So to the extent that the Chinese are going to offer jobs, that will reinforce what you're asking about. Certainly that's going to enhance language capability.
We have time for one more question.
Professor, quick question. Do you think Russians
Who are you?
this is Yang from Power Energy. Quick question. Are the Russians worried about Chinese coming into the region?
Oh, absolutely. As I said, of the three major outside powers, the U.S., Russia, and China, the U.S. influence in Central Asia is very likely to decline. And the Russians still see themselves as the primus inter pares. But as I answered Jan, because the Chinese are going to have jobs to offer, they're going to have greater influence. Now, the long-term cultural ties to Moscow may gradually attrit, It also depends how Russia does economically. If Russia implodes as a result of mismanagement, then they're not going to have any extra resources to pursue these things. And the Chinese clearly still have that. Now, if the Chinese economy turns south in a serious way, then many of these pledges that the Chinese have made probably won't be implemented anytime soon. But if you had to bet on who is going to be the new heavyweight, it's clearly going to be China. And I would say that the Russians not only are worried about this, they're going to try to undercut it. So the Chinese are members, for example, of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but they don't actively participate, and they don't do anything positive in it. It's the Chinese who are pushing the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so please join me in thanking Professor Denoon. And we have copies of the book for sale in the back, so please buy several, and Deb will sign them for you. Thank you very much.